Hello, welcome. I am glad you are here. Take a deep breath and settle in, allowing yourself to relax and let the world slow down around you. Tonight, we are going to take a gentle journey through history, exploring one of the most significant events of the late 20th century, a story about walls and freedom, fear and hope, and ultimately, the remarkable moment when people reclaimed their liberty in a city that had been divided for decades. This is a calm history story for sleep, a bedtime story that will carry you softly through the events that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. The story begins long before the wall was built, in the aftermath of a world torn apart by a war so vast and destructive that the map of Europe had to be redrawn almost entirely. The year was 1945, and Germany lay in ruins, its cities shattered by bombings, its people weary, hungry, and uncertain of the future. The defeat of Nazi Germany had brought relief to millions, but it also left a vacuum of authority and a question of who would guide the country forward. In the West, the United States, the United Kingdom, and later France occupied parts of the country, providing governance, aid, and a vision for a democratic future. In the East, the Soviet Union had swept in, bringing with it the ideology of communism, determined to shape the new Germany according to its principles and strategic interests. Berlin, the capital, became a focal point of this post-war tension. Though it was located deep inside the Soviet zone, the city itself was divided into 4 sectors, each controlled by one of the Allied powers. The streets of Berlin, once bustling with life, were filled with rubble and echoes of the past. Families were displaced, buildings destroyed, and the once proud landmarks of the city stood as hollow reminders of the conflict that had engulfed the world. In the midst of this devastation, people began to rebuild, but the differences between the occupying powers soon became apparent. In the West, Americans and their allies encouraged economic recovery, free markets, and political freedom. Factories were rebuilt, schools reopened, and there was a sense of cautious optimism. In the East, the Soviets implemented a different approach, emphasizing centralized control, state ownership, and the creation of a socialist society. Tensions grew as both sides sought to solidify their influence, and Berlin became a symbol of the larger struggle between 2 emerging superpowers. By 1949, these tensions had solidified into 2 distinct German states. The Federal Republic of Germany was established in the West, embracing democracy and aligning with Western Europe and the United States. The German Democratic Republic arose in the East, under the influence of the Soviet Union, and committed to the ideals of socialism and centralized governance. Berlin, still divided into sectors, remained a city caught between these 2 worlds. Life in East Berlin and West Berlin began to diverge in noticeable ways. In the West, the streets were slowly filled with commerce, entertainment, and a growing sense of opportunity. In the East, the government exercised strict control over political activity, the press, and the flow of information, while the state maintained close surveillance over its citizens. As the 1950s progressed, the differences became impossible to ignore. East Germans could see the prosperity and freedom enjoyed by their neighbors in the West, and many longed to experience the same liberties. The city became a point of tension, and the border between East and West, though carefully controlled, was crossed regularly by those seeking a better life. People would risk everything, sometimes fleeing in the dead of night, other times crossing through legal checkpoints, hoping to find opportunity or reunite with family members. The government of East Germany grew increasingly concerned about the exodus of its citizens. By 1961, the pressure had reached a critical point. Thousands of East Germans were leaving for the West every week, draining the country of workers, professionals, and young people. The leadership feared that if this trend continued, the very survival of the East German state would be in jeopardy. In a decisive move, the government began constructing a physical barrier, a wall that would cut through the heart of Berlin, dividing families, friends, and neighborhoods. The Berlin Wall was erected overnight, a concrete and wire barrier that transformed the landscape and the lives of those who lived there. The wall was more than just concrete. It was a symbol of division, a stark reminder of the political and ideological struggle that shaped Europe for decades. Guards patrolled its length, checkpoints were established, and crossing the border became nearly impossible. Life on either side of the wall developed its own rhythm. West Berlin became an island of democracy and relative prosperity within East Germany, while East Berliners navigated a society constrained by government oversight and limited freedoms. Yet, despite the wall, the human spirit persisted. Stories of courage, daring escapes, and quiet resistance unfolded across the city, a testament to the resilience of ordinary people living under extraordinary circumstances. Decades passed, and the world changed in countless ways. Political movements emerged, economies evolved, and the rigid structures of the Cold War began to show cracks. In Eastern Europe, reforms and pressures from the people grew. By the late 1980s, the winds of change were sweeping through the continent. Governments that had once seemed unyielding faced the undeniable demand for freedom, transparency, and opportunity. In East Germany, the same desires simmered just below the surface. Citizens organized protests, wrote petitions, and quietly pushed for reform, inspired by the changes occurring in neighboring countries. The story of the Berlin Wall's fall is not a tale of a single moment, but a culmination of decades of hope, struggle, and human determination. On the 9th of November, 1989, a chain of events unfolded that would forever change the city and the world. Miscommunication, political shifts, and the sheer force of public demand converged to create an opening. Citizens gathered at checkpoints, unsure of what to expect, and the guards, overwhelmed and unprepared, allowed them to pass. That night, East and West Berliners celebrated together, climbing on the wall, embracing one another, and marking the end of a division that had lasted for almost 30 years. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a moment of triumph, not only for Berlin, but for the ideals of freedom, unity, and hope. It was a reminder that walls, no matter how imposing, can never fully contain the human spirit. It also set the stage for the eventual reunification of Germany and signaled a turning point in global history, marking the symbolic end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era. Even as the wall came down physically, the echoes of its history remained. The stories of families separated, of daring escapes, of ordinary lives disrupted by extraordinary politics continued to resonate. The city slowly transformed, rebuilding itself and weaving the fabric of East and West into a single, shared community once again. This story, though calm and gentle in its telling tonight, is rich with complexity, with decades of events, choices, and human experiences that led to that night of celebration in November 1989, and there is so much more to explore, from the personal stories of those who lived with the wall every day, to the global forces that shaped its creation and ultimate fall, to the quiet moments of courage that defined the lives of countless individuals. After the wall went up in 1961, life in Berlin changed in ways that were both immediate and subtle. Streets that once allowed free passage between neighborhoods became dead ends. Familiar paths to work, school, or friends were blocked, and people learned to navigate a city that had suddenly become fractured. Families who had once shared meals across a street or spent evenings together found themselves separated by concrete and barbed wire. Parents worried for their children, and children worried for their parents. Life required careful planning, and every decision carried the weight of political reality. Yet, despite the physical barrier, human activity continued. Shops remained open in both halves of the city, children played in playgrounds near the wall, and life went on. People adapted as they always do. In West Berlin, citizens developed a sense of identity that was distinct from the rest of West Germany, aware that they were surrounded by East Germany, yet determined to preserve their freedoms. East Berliners lived with a constant awareness of surveillance, checkpoints, and the rules that governed their movement. Even small acts of daily life, like crossing a street or sending a letter, carried significance because of the barriers in place. The construction of the wall was more than a local event. It was a clear symbol of the broader geopolitical conflict that defined the era. The United States and the Soviet Union, each with their own vision for the world, had drawn a line through the middle of a city, creating a tangible manifestation of the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. Over the years, the presence of the wall influenced the culture, the economy, and the psychology of the citizens living on either side. West Berlin became a focal point for Western ideas, investments, and cultural exchange. Its streets were filled with schools, theaters, and businesses that thrived despite the city's isolated position. The air carried the energy of innovation and resilience, and the people who lived there understood that their existence was tied to the support of the Western powers. The Berlin airlift in 1948-49 had been an early demonstration of that support, when Western allies supplied the city from the air in the face of a Soviet blockade. It had left a lasting impression, creating a sense of solidarity and determination that would persist for decades. In the East, life followed a different rhythm. Citizens were subject to government oversight, state-controlled media, and limited personal freedom. Surveillance by the Stasi, the State Security Service, created a sense of quiet caution that touched every aspect of life. People learned to be careful with words, to measure their actions, and to adapt to rules that could change with little notice. The wall itself became a tool of both control and propaganda, a constant visual reminder of the divide and the political narrative it represented. Over the years, many East Berliners attempted to cross to the West, motivated by the desire for freedom, opportunity, or simply the curiosity of seeing life on the other side. Some succeeded through careful planning, creative methods, and sometimes sheer luck. Others were caught or worse, and the risks were high. The wall, with its fortified checkpoints, guards, and patrols, was intended to prevent such crossings, yet it also became a silent witness to acts of courage and determination. Every successful escape, every story of someone reaching the West, added to the tension between the two sides and to the hope that the situation might one day change. Internationally, the Berlin Wall was a constant topic of discussion, debate, and tension. Leaders on both sides of the Cold War recognized its symbolic significance. In the West, the wall represented oppression, the limitation of human freedom, and the tangible presence of Soviet control in Europe. In the East, it was described as a protective measure, a barrier against fascist influences, and a way to maintain social order. Both interpretations were tied to broader political narratives, yet the wall itself remained an undeniable, unyielding fact on the landscape of Berlin. As the decades passed, East Germany faced economic challenges that increasingly set it apart from the prosperity of the West. Citizens could see the differences clearly: the availability of goods, the quality of services, and the opportunities for education and employment all highlighted the contrast between the two systems. These differences created quiet dissatisfaction, and small acts of resistance, protest, or nonconformity became more common. Citizens wrote letters, joined petitions, or participated in organized movements, often risking personal consequences. By the 1980s, changes elsewhere in Eastern Europe began to ripple across East Germany. Governments in neighboring countries initiated reforms, opening borders or loosening restrictions, and citizens watched closely. The presence of these examples, combined with growing dissatisfaction at home, created an atmosphere in which change felt both possible and necessary. East Berliners began to organize more openly, attending meetings, participating in demonstrations, and voicing demands for reform. Each act, however small, added to the cumulative pressure on the government. It is important to note that the fall of the Berlin Wall was not the result of a single, dramatic confrontation, but rather a long build-up of political, social, and human factors. The wall had existed for nearly 3 decades, and during that time, countless events, decisions, and experiences contributed to the environment that made its eventual collapse possible. Leaders both in East Germany and abroad were aware of the growing pressures, and policy discussions, negotiations, and public statements reflected the complex realities of the time. In October 1989, East Germany experienced a wave of demonstrations unlike anything seen before in the country. Citizens gathered in streets and squares, calling for freedom to travel, reform in governance, and respect for human rights. The protests were generally peaceful, though the sheer number of participants made it difficult for the authorities to manage the situation. The movement reflected years of accumulated frustration, the influence of change in other countries, and the fundamental human desire for freedom and dignity. Within the government, debates and uncertainty grew. Leaders recognized that maintaining strict control was becoming increasingly difficult and that concessions might be necessary. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens continued to gather, exchange information, and plan actions. The dynamic between government caution and public determination set the stage for the events that would soon follow. On November 9, 1989, a pivotal moment occurred. An official announcement about travel regulations was made in a way that created confusion. Citizens, interpreting the announcement as permission to cross into the West immediately, began gathering at checkpoints in large numbers. The border guards, unprepared and uncertain about how to respond, faced a crowd that refused to disperse. After some hesitation, they opened the gates. What followed was not organized or planned in advance. Instead, it was the spontaneous result of years of build-up, of policies and pressures, of personal courage and collective will. People flowed across the checkpoints, some climbing the wall, others simply walking through, embracing neighbors and strangers alike. The city of Berlin became a scene of celebration, yet also a moment of quiet reflection for those who had lived with the wall for so long. This was not only the fall of a physical barrier, but also a moment that revealed the deep human desire for connection, freedom, and the right to choose one's own path. The days that followed allowed the city to begin a slow process of reunification. Citizens explored neighborhoods that had been inaccessible for decades. Families reunited and communities began to reintegrate into a single city once again. The fall of the wall was the beginning, not the end, of a process that would continue over months and years as Berlin worked to heal the divisions and integrate its two halves into a functioning, unified community. At the same time, the event carried lessons for the wider world. It was a reminder that political systems, no matter how rigid they seem, are ultimately shaped by the will of the people. It highlighted the importance of resilience, the accumulation of persistent effort, and the power of ordinary citizens to influence history, and it revealed a broader truth: barriers imposed from above, whether physical, social, or political, can never fully suppress the human spirit when there is a desire for freedom and connection. In the months and years following the opening of the Berlin Wall, the process of reunification began in both practical and emotional ways. The streets that had been divided for decades slowly reconnected, though the changes did not happen overnight. Shops reopened in neighborhoods that had been abandoned or neglected. Public transportation was adjusted to connect the former East and West. Families that had grown apart began to spend time together again. Every corner of the city carried stories of lives interrupted and resumed. People walked cautiously at first, learning the rhythms of a city that was familiar yet profoundly different from the one they had known before the wall fell. The political landscape of Germany was transformed along with the physical city. The German Democratic Republic, once a separate state with its own government, economy, and laws, became integrated into the Federal Republic of Germany. Policy decisions had to be carefully managed, infrastructure rebuilt, and legal systems harmonized. It was a slow and deliberate process requiring negotiation, compromise, and patience. Citizens adjusted their expectations as they witnessed how long it would take to bridge the economic and social differences between the two sides. Yet even as the city worked to heal, the memory of the wall remained a powerful presence. Photographs, fragments of concrete, and guard towers were preserved in museums and public spaces. People told their stories, recounting the challenges of daily life, the attempts to escape, and the small acts of courage that had defined their experience. Children who had grown up with the wall as a constant presence learned about it through their parents' stories and through visits to historical sites. The wall became a teacher, a reminder of the consequences of division and the resilience required to overcome it. The broader international context also played a role in the significance of the wall's fall. The Cold War, which had defined much of the second half of the 20th century, began to shift as leaders in the United States, the Soviet Union, and Europe reassessed their positions. Diplomatic communications, economic considerations, and the changing political climate in Eastern Europe all contributed to an environment in which the wall's removal became possible. It was not merely a local event, but a reflection of larger global forces, the intersection of personal and political histories that had been developing for decades. Life in Berlin itself slowly adjusted to a new reality. Businesses that had once operated in isolation now had access to a wider market. Schools and universities worked to integrate students from both sides, blending curricula and adjusting expectations. Cultural institutions collaborated to share art, music, and literature, reconnecting communities that had been separated by ideology and circumstance. Every public event, every concert, every exhibition carried a sense of both celebration and remembrance. People recognized that the moment of freedom they had experienced was the result of persistent effort, not a sudden miracle. The economic disparities between East and West Germany presented a challenge that required long-term planning. While West Berlin had developed with investment and access to Western resources, East Berlin had lagged behind in infrastructure, industry, and public services. Bridging this gap demanded significant resources, policy planning, and social programs. Citizens on both sides participated in the transformation, contributing labor, ideas, and cooperation to rebuild a unified city. It was an ongoing process, and progress was measured in small, steady steps rather than dramatic leaps. One of the quieter but significant consequences of the wall's fall was the way it shaped memory and identity. People who had grown up in East Berlin carried with them habits and perspectives shaped by decades of controlled society. West Berliners carried their own experiences and expectations. Integrating these identities required empathy, understanding, and patience. The wall had divided not only geography, but also lived experience. Reunification was as much a psychological process as it was a practical or political one, and it required people to navigate complex feelings of relief, loss, curiosity, and uncertainty. At the same time, the story of the wall revealed a larger theme that became increasingly clear over time: human persistence in the face of imposed limits. The wall itself was designed to prevent movement, to enforce separation, and to assert control. Yet for decades, people found ways to resist, adapt, and maintain hope. Some fled, risking everything. Some protested, demanding change. Some waited patiently, seeking small acts of improvement in daily life. The eventual collapse of the wall was not simply the result of a single decision or announcement. It was the culmination of countless efforts, large and small, by individuals and communities determined to live freely. In retrospect, it is possible to trace the path from the wall's construction to its fall as a long chain of cause and effect. The immediate reasons for building the wall, emigration, political pressure, economic concerns, were clear at the time. Yet the underlying currents, the human desire for freedom, the need for connection, and the persistence of hope, were equally powerful. These currents shaped behavior, influenced decisions, and ultimately created the conditions in which a wall, no matter how imposing, could no longer stand. The stories of those who lived on both sides illustrate this theme in concrete ways. A young student in East Berlin might have listened to forbidden radio broadcasts from the West, learning about life beyond the wall. A factory worker might have quietly exchanged ideas with colleagues, testing the limits of what could be discussed safely. Families found ways to communicate across the barrier, sending letters or arranging rare visits. Each of these small acts contributed to the larger momentum that eventually made the wall untenable. Even the international actors were shaped by these dynamics. Western leaders understood that East Germany could not maintain control indefinitely without significant social and economic consequences. Soviet leaders, observing the growing unrest and the changes in other Eastern European countries, recognized that maintaining the status quo was increasingly difficult. These pressures, combined with the persistent human desire for freedom within East Germany itself, created a unique moment in history when change became not only possible but inevitable. By the late 1980s, the theme of the story was becoming clearer to observers on both sides of the walls, even those reinforced with concrete and guards, could not contain the fundamental drive for human freedom and connection. The physical division of Berlin was mirrored by social, cultural, and political divides, but these too were susceptible to persistence, communication, and collective action. The eventual fall of the wall illustrated that structural barriers, no matter how strong, are ultimately limited by human will. The events of November 1989 did not occur in isolation. In the months leading up to that day, there had been steady pressure from public protests, increasing media coverage, and shifting policies in neighboring countries. Citizens attended demonstrations, organized petitions, and maintained the attention of local and international media. Each act was measured, deliberate, and part of a continuous effort to assert the desire for change. The accumulation of these actions, rather than a single dramatic confrontation, created the conditions in which the wall could finally open. On the day the wall fell, the mood in Berlin was complex. Citizens approached checkpoints cautiously, uncertain of what would happen. Guards, faced with an unexpected and overwhelming crowd, had to make quick decisions. Rather than confrontation, they allowed passage. People crossed with a mixture of disbelief and elation. Families embraced, friends reunited, and strangers celebrated together. The moment was spontaneous yet grounded in decades of preparation, of hope, resistance, and persistence. Afterward, as the city began to physically dismantle the wall, the theme of persistence continued to resonate. People used hammers and chisels to break apart the concrete. They collected pieces as souvenirs or memorials, preserving a fragment of history. The act of dismantling the wall, carried out by ordinary citizens, reinforced the message that structures designed to divide could be undone through consistent effort, collective action, and determination. The slow but deliberate rebuilding of the city in the years that followed highlighted the continuing relevance of this theme. Infrastructure had to be restored, social services harmonized, and communities reintegrated. Citizens contributed through labor, creativity, and cooperation. The integration of two distinct social systems required patience, empathy, and shared commitment. The lesson of the wall's fall extended beyond the physical barrier to the broader understanding that unity and freedom are achieved gradually through sustained effort. The human stories from this period continued to provide insight into the larger historical narrative. Teachers, students, and workers adapted to new conditions. Families reunited and reconciled with long-standing separations. Local leaders negotiated the integration of services and institutions. Every interaction reflected the broader theme of persistence overcoming division, of human will shaping circumstances over time. Even decades later, the memory of the wall remains powerful. Berlin preserves parts of it as a historical monument. Museums tell the stories of the people who lived with the wall, documenting their struggles, escapes, and acts of courage. The city itself stands as a testament to the idea that physical, political, and ideological barriers can be overcome through patient, determined action. The fall of the Berlin Wall is often remembered as a single night of celebration, but the deeper story is one of sustained effort, of small acts that accumulate over time to produce monumental change. Each protest, each letter, each act of quiet resistance contributed to a momentum that ultimately reshaped the city and the world. It demonstrates that human persistence, when guided by a desire for freedom and connection, can ultimately overcome structures that appear immovable. As the months turned into years after the wall's collapse, Berlin slowly transformed, yet the memory of the division remained ever present. Streets that had been interrupted by concrete barriers now ran freely again, but subtle differences between neighborhoods persisted. Buildings in the east bore the marks of decades of underinvestment, while those in the west reflected the relative prosperity of capitalist development. Rebuilding was not just a matter of infrastructure, but of social cohesion, requiring people to learn once again how to live alongside neighbors who had grown up under very different circumstances. The theme of persistence and human determination became increasingly evident in the way communities approached this reintegration. Citizens from both sides worked together to rebuild schools, theaters, and public spaces. They shared knowledge, skills, and experiences that had developed under vastly different social systems. Teachers who had been trained under strict regulations in the East adapted to new curricula and pedagogical approaches, while students navigated the merging of different educational standards. Small acts of cooperation, repeated over time, created a foundation for a functioning, unified city. Economic disparities remained a challenge, and for many former East Berliners, the transition was neither easy nor immediate. Jobs had to be found, businesses re-established, and daily life adapted to a new economic reality. Some struggled to understand the capitalist market system, while others embraced the opportunities it presented. Over time, however, the steady efforts of individuals and communities began to narrow the gap, illustrating that lasting change requires patience, resilience, and continuous effort. The fall of the wall also had a profound psychological impact. For decades, East Berliners had lived with a constant sense of limitation, surveillance, and control. The sudden ability to move freely, speak openly, and access information from outside their former borders was exhilarating, yet also disorienting. People needed time to adjust, to build confidence in their own agency, and to navigate the complexities of newfound freedom. Meanwhile, West Berliners, who had lived in relative stability, had to recognize and accommodate the experiences of their Eastern neighbors. The merging of these worlds required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to confront both shared and divergent histories. In the broader context, the fall of the Berlin Wall sent reverberations across the world. Eastern European nations observed Berlin's transformation and were inspired to pursue their own reforms. Governments that had once appeared inflexible now faced the clear reality that persistent citizen action, coupled with political and economic pressures, could precipitate change. The wall's collapse was not an isolated event, but a reflection of a global shift in the late 20th century, where entrenched structures of power were increasingly challenged by human persistence and collective determination. Stories of ordinary citizens illustrate this theme vividly. In East Berlin, a young woman might have spent years saving a small sum to visit family in the West. A father might have secretly passed letters to relatives, careful to avoid detection by the authorities. A student might have listened to forbidden radio broadcasts at night, learning about life beyond the wall and quietly sharing the knowledge with friends. These small, patient acts, repeated across thousands of lives, created the pressure that eventually made the wall unsustainable. It was not one dramatic act that caused change, but the accumulation of countless decisions, risks, and moments of courage over time. Political leaders, too, were influenced by these persistent pressures. East German officials faced growing unrest from citizens demanding reform, while Soviet leadership watched carefully as other Eastern European nations began to loosen restrictions. Policy discussions, both public and private, reflected a careful consideration of how to respond to an increasingly impatient populace. The eventual announcement on November 9, 1989, which allowed citizens to cross freely, was shaped as much by human determination as by political calculation. As Berliners walked through newly opened checkpoints that night, the significance of the moment extended beyond immediate celebration. Families reunited, neighbors embraced, and strangers shared in the collective experience of newfound freedom. Yet beneath the visible joy was a deeper understanding. Decades of barriers, control, and isolation had been challenged and overcome. The event demonstrated that change is rarely instantaneous. It is the result of ongoing effort, resilience, and the accumulation of small acts of courage and persistence. The dismantling of the wall itself became a symbolic act. Ordinary citizens used hammers and chisels to remove fragments of concrete. Pieces were kept as mementos, and sections were preserved in museums to educate future generations. The physical destruction of the wall mirrored the broader transformation of society. Structures intended to divide were gradually replaced with connections, roads, bridges, public spaces, and shared institutions. Each act of removal reinforced the message that walls, no matter how imposing, are ultimately subject to human agency when the collective will is determined. Even as the city physically reconstructed itself, the social and cultural integration required ongoing patience. East Berliners adapted to Western norms, while West Berliners learned to acknowledge and respect the experiences of those who had lived under decades of state control. Public institutions adjusted their operations, schools harmonized their curricula, and workplaces integrated employees from both sides. Every aspect of life, from the personal to the political, reflected the long-term effort required to transform a divided society into a cohesive one. The theme of persistence is evident in the personal stories that emerged from this period. An artist in the former East might have struggled to have their work recognized in the new unified city, yet continued to create, gradually gaining appreciation and visibility. A teacher might have dedicated long hours to bridging educational gaps between students with different backgrounds, fostering understanding and opportunity. Individuals, through repeated effort and patience, contributed to the broader reconstruction of a city and a society that had been shaped by division for decades. Internationally, the fall of the wall influenced the course of history. Leaders in other nations observed the success of citizen persistence and the relatively peaceful transition, drawing lessons about the limits of control and the potential for reform. Eastern European countries, inspired by Berlin, pursued similar paths of change, reshaping their own societies and political structures. The story of the Berlin Wall's fall became an emblem of the broader human capacity to overcome obstacles, demonstrating that sustained effort, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable barriers, can yield profound transformation. As years passed, the city of Berlin developed a collective memory of the wall and its fall. Historical education emphasized both the factual events and the human experiences behind them. Museums and memorials documented individual stories, illustrating the daily realities of life with the wall and the persistence required to navigate those years. Public commemorations reinforced the lesson that freedom and unity are achieved through continuous, patient effort. The wall became a symbol not only of division, but also of what can be overcome through persistence and collective determination. Even decades later, new generations of Berliners learn about the wall through history, art, and memory. They hear stories from parents, grandparents, and neighbors about life in a divided city. They visit preserved sections of the wall, walk along former borderlines, and reflect on the resilience and determination of those who lived through decades of separation. These experiences reinforce the theme that human effort, consistently applied, can reshape even the most rigid of structures. The fall of the Berlin Wall also provides a broader reflection on the relationship between people and political structures. Governments can impose rules, barriers, and surveillance, but the underlying human drive for connection, freedom, and dignity persists. Persistent, patient, and organized action, even on a small scale, can gradually reshape societal and political realities. The story of Berlin demonstrates that the accumulation of these efforts, rather than sudden or violent confrontation, often leads to lasting transformation. As Berlin rebuilt and integrated, the city became a living example of this principle. Infrastructure, schools, businesses, and social networks all reflected the ongoing effort required to maintain cohesion. Citizens participated in daily acts of cooperation, from simple neighborly interactions to community-wide projects. Each act, repeated over time, reinforced the larger process of unity and reconciliation. The memory of division remained, but it was tempered by the evidence that consistent effort, combined with human determination, could reshape society. The human element in the fall of the wall cannot be overstated. Individuals made countless decisions, often small and unnoticed, that collectively produced change. Choosing to attend a demonstration, sending letters, listening to outside broadcasts, maintaining hope despite obstacles. Each of these actions contributed to a momentum that the wall itself could not resist. The story emphasizes that historical change is rarely the result of a single event or a single person. Instead, it emerges from the aggregation of decisions, actions, and persistence by many over time. As Berliners continued to navigate the new reality after the wall fell, daily life became an ongoing process of adjustment. People who had grown up in East Berlin were learning the rhythms of a city that had developed under very different conditions. Streets, once unfamiliar, became avenues of discovery, and neighborhoods carried histories that were gradually being shared and understood. West Berliners, accustomed to a different pace and level of freedom, encountered their neighbors' experiences and perspectives for the first time in decades. Through this slow process of interaction, the city began to develop a shared identity, grounded in both memory and aspiration. Economic integration was one of the most tangible challenges. Former East Berliners faced disparities in employment opportunities, wages, and access to resources. Many had professional skills and education that did not align neatly with the systems in the West, and adapting to a capitalist economy required effort, learning, and patience. Business leaders, government agencies, and ordinary citizens worked to bridge these gaps. Training programs, infrastructure development, and policy adjustments were implemented to create opportunities and support integration. Every step, small or large, was part of a broader movement toward unity. The social landscape also evolved gradually. Families reunited after decades of separation, sometimes discovering that relationships needed time to readjust. Neighbors who had lived with suspicion or distance began to form new bonds. Schools and universities integrated students from different backgrounds, creating classrooms that reflected the diversity of experience within the city. Teachers guided students through the process of understanding both historical division and contemporary unity. The everyday interactions of citizens, repeated across neighborhoods and institutions, were the subtle mechanisms through which the city healed itself. Political systems had to adjust as well. The laws, regulations, and institutions of East Germany were gradually merged with those of the Federal Republic, creating a unified governance structure. This process required careful planning, negotiation, and compromise. Officials in both the East and the West recognized that maintaining stability while pursuing integration demanded both patience and foresight. Policies were implemented incrementally, reflecting the understanding that lasting change is rarely instantaneous. One of the enduring lessons of the wall's fall was the impact of persistent action over time. Citizens in East Berlin had long expressed dissatisfaction, organized petitions, and participated in peaceful demonstrations. Each act was a small contribution to a larger movement that slowly reshaped the political and social reality of the city. The eventual opening of the wall was the culmination of decades of cumulative effort, not the result of a single dramatic act. The story emphasizes that persistence, when consistently applied, can overcome barriers that seem insurmountable. Cultural integration also played a significant role in unifying the city. Museums, theaters, and art institutions worked to bring together the experiences of both sides. Exhibitions highlighted the history of the wall, the lives of those who lived with it, and the stories of resistance and adaptation. Music, literature, and film offered avenues for understanding and empathy. Through shared cultural experiences, citizens developed a sense of common identity, bridging the gap created by decades of division. The wall had also shaped the psychology of the city. Decades of separation had fostered habits, expectations, and ways of thinking that differed on either side. East Berliners had adapted to controlled environments, limited freedoms, and close surveillance. West Berliners had lived with a degree of autonomy and opportunity that had shaped their outlook. The merging of these psychological landscapes required patience, dialogue, and understanding. Small interactions, a conversation with a neighbor, a shared meal, participation in community events, became opportunities to reconcile these experiences. Internationally, the fall of the wall inspired reflection and action. Countries across Eastern Europe observed the peaceful transition and considered their own paths toward reform. Governments recognized that citizen persistence, when combined with social, economic, and political pressures, could lead to significant change. Berlin became a case study in how long-term human determination can intersect with political circumstance to produce transformation. The lesson was clear: structural obstacles, even those enforced with power and force, are ultimately vulnerable to sustained, collective action. As reconstruction continued, stories of ordinary individuals illustrated this principle repeatedly. A young teacher might spend years bridging educational gaps between students from East and West, creating opportunities for understanding and success. An entrepreneur might rebuild a business, connecting resources and ideas from both sides to create something new. Families continued to adjust, navigating the legacy of separation while building shared memories. These repeated, patient efforts contributed to a broader transformation, demonstrating the slow but undeniable power of persistence. Public spaces became symbols of both memory and renewal. Sections of the wall were preserved as monuments, while other areas were cleared for parks, roads, and buildings that connected the city physically and socially. Citizens engaged in conversations about the meaning of these spaces, reflecting on the past while imagining the future. Through these dialogues and interactions, the city's collective understanding evolved, emphasizing the continuity of human effort over time. The theme of gradual, persistent change also extended to governance and policy. Integrating the social systems of East and West Berlin required thoughtful attention to the needs of citizens. Public services, healthcare, and education systems were harmonized over years. Officials in both former sectors collaborated, making incremental adjustments that reflected the complexity of reunification. Every decision, repeated and reinforced over time, helped build a functional, cohesive city. The fall of the wall revealed another important aspect of historical change: the interplay between individual and collective action. Personal choices, attending a demonstration, sharing forbidden information, maintaining hope in difficult circumstances, interacted with broader social and political dynamics to produce lasting results. The wall's collapse illustrates how the accumulation of individual persistence can influence structures that seem unyielding. Each citizen contributed in small, tangible ways to a larger historical outcome. Even as decades passed, Berlin continued to grapple with the legacy of the wall. Former East and West Berliners occasionally recalled the differences in upbringing, opportunities, and expectations. Yet over time, shared experiences and repeated collaboration reinforced unity. Schools educated students about the wall not only as a historical event, but as a demonstration of the power of human persistence. Museums presented narratives emphasizing individual courage and collective effort, reinforcing the lesson that transformation requires sustained action over time. The story of Berlin also highlights the relationship between hope and patience. Citizens lived for years with the wall as an undeniable presence, yet continued to act, plan, and hope for a future in which barriers would fall. They did not abandon their desire for freedom, even when the possibility seemed distant. Over time, their consistent efforts contributed to conditions in which dramatic change became possible. The fall of the wall thus represents not only the collapse of a physical barrier, but also the fulfillment of long-term human determination. Cultural and social practices adapted to reflect these changes. Community events, celebrations, and educational programs encouraged understanding between people with different experiences. These repeated acts of engagement gradually reduced mistrust and fostered collaboration. Public art and commemorations highlighted stories of resilience and persistence, reinforcing the broader theme of gradual, sustained change in both physical and social landscapes. As Berliners reflected on the decades of division, the importance of patient, persistent effort became increasingly clear. While the wall had appeared permanent, built with concrete, guards, and ideology, it ultimately succumbed to the accumulation of countless small acts by individuals and communities over time. The city's history demonstrates that barriers, no matter how formidable, are not invulnerable when human will is consistently applied. The ongoing reconstruction of society in Berlin further illustrates the point. Economic disparities, social habits, and cultural differences required careful attention. Over years, repeated engagement, cooperation, and dialogue helped bridge gaps. Individuals contributed through daily actions, working together, educating, volunteering, or simply maintaining respectful communication with neighbors. Each act added to the collective momentum toward unity and cohesion. The global significance of the wall's fall also reflected these themes. Nations observed the peaceful transition and drew lessons about governance, citizen engagement, and the limits of imposed control. The Berlin experience demonstrated that long-term, patient persistence can produce profound change without violent upheaval. The lesson extended beyond the city itself, providing insight into the dynamics of political, social, and human transformation in broader contexts. The psychological aspect of this transformation was equally important. Citizens had to overcome internalized limitations, fear, and habits formed under decades of separation. By gradually exercising newfound freedoms, participating in public life, and engaging with neighbors from different backgrounds, they contributed to a collective healing process. This gradual change reinforced the principle that persistent, repeated action is essential for sustainable transformation. Stories of individual courage continued to surface as the city rebuilt. People recounted daring escapes, acts of quiet resistance, and moments of creativity that defied the constraints of the wall. These narratives, shared publicly through media, museums, and personal accounts, emphasized the interplay between individual persistence and historical outcomes. They reinforced the understanding that significant change is rarely the result of isolated events, but emerges from cumulative effort sustained over time. In the years following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the city's transformation continued quietly, day by day, in ways that were often invisible to outsiders. People adjusted to a new reality in which movement, communication, and choice were once again possible without restrictions. Streets that had long been divided by checkpoints, barbed wire, and watchtowers now flowed freely with pedestrians, bicycles, and vehicles. Neighborhoods that had been cut off from one another for decades began to reconnect, and slowly, communities began to rediscover their shared identity. The process of reunification was not immediate or simple. Infrastructure in the former East had suffered from underinvestment, and buildings required repair or modernization. Utilities, transportation systems, and public services needed to be harmonized with those in the West. Each improvement, no matter how small, was part of a larger, long-term process that required patience, coordination, and careful planning. People adjusted to changes in their daily lives, from using public transportation across newly integrated routes to accessing goods and services that had previously been unavailable. The social adaptation was equally gradual. Families who had been separated by the wall slowly reunited, and children who had grown up with division learned about life on the other side through stories, visits, and school projects. Neighbors who had never interacted due to the barrier now had opportunities to meet, converse, and cooperate. Each interaction reinforced a slowly emerging sense of community and shared purpose. The city's residents discovered that the process of rebuilding social cohesion required repeated, patient effort just as much as the reconstruction of physical structures. Economic integration presented its own challenges. Citizens of the former East were suddenly exposed to a system in which wages, opportunities, and competition operated very differently from what they had known. Jobs that had once been secure in state-run industries required adaptation to a new market-driven economy. Many workers invested time and energy into retraining, learning new skills, and seeking opportunities that would allow them to thrive in the unified system. Over time, these individual acts of persistence contributed to the gradual reduction of economic disparities between the two halves of the city. Education played a central role in bridging the social and cultural divide. Schools integrated students from East and West, bringing together young people with very different experiences, habits, and expectations. Teachers worked diligently to create curricula that respected the history and knowledge of both sides, while preparing students for the new realities of a unified city and country. Small, repeated efforts, lessons, discussions, joint projects helped students understand one another, build empathy, and develop shared goals. Education became a quiet but powerful mechanism for fostering long-term unity. Political integration required careful planning and sustained attention. Laws, regulations, and administrative systems from East and West Germany had to be harmonized to form a coherent governance structure. Local leaders, bureaucrats, and citizens engaged in long-term negotiations to ensure that the integration was smooth, fair, and sustainable. These processes reinforced the central theme of the story: persistent effort over time, combined with careful planning, can overcome obstacles that initially seem unyielding. The psychological impact of the wall's legacy was another factor that shaped the city's slow transformation. East Berliners had grown accustomed to a system in which surveillance, control, and limited choice were part of daily life. West Berliners had developed habits and expectations based on relative freedom and prosperity. Integrating these two perspectives required patience, empathy, and repeated interactions. Neighborhood meetings, cultural events, and public forums became spaces for dialogue, helping citizens understand one another and develop mutual trust. Through countless small acts, both sides of the city contributed to the gradual rebuilding of shared identity. Cultural exchange became a central part of this process. Museums, theaters, and galleries worked to combine the experiences of the city's divided past. Art exhibitions highlighted stories of life with the wall, resistance, and escape. Concerts, theater performances, and literary events encouraged participation from both former East and West Berliners. Over time, these shared cultural experiences helped reduce mistrust and foster a sense of belonging, reinforcing the slow but steady rebuilding of the social fabric. The human stories of the wall's fall continued to emerge and shape the collective memory of the city. Individuals recounted their own experiences of life under division, navigating checkpoints, finding ways to communicate with loved ones, or quietly resisting restrictions in small but meaningful ways. These personal narratives were collected in books, documentaries, and museum exhibits, emphasizing the role of ordinary citizens in shaping extraordinary historical outcomes. The repeated efforts of countless individuals over decades were the foundation upon which the dramatic moment of the wall's opening ultimately rested. In practical terms, the removal of the wall required careful coordination. Sections were dismantled, concrete removed, and watchtowers decommissioned. Some portions were preserved as memorials or historical markers, reminding future generations of the city's divided past. Citizens participated in these efforts directly, whether by volunteering in cleanup projects, documenting the history, or organizing public events to commemorate the fall. Each of these acts, repeated by many people across time, reinforced the broader theme that sustained effort can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The broader European context also shaped Berlin's transformation. Neighboring countries observed the city's example, noting the peaceful and deliberate process by which citizens and governments worked to integrate society. Eastern European nations began to consider reforms of their own, inspired in part by the model of patient, persistent change that Berlin represented. The city became a symbol of the power of incremental, repeated effort to produce lasting social, political, and economic transformation. Personal stories from this period illustrate the theme of persistence in tangible ways. A worker who had trained for a specific role in the East might spend years retraining for a new position in the integrated economy. A student might dedicate themselves to mastering subjects that were previously unfamiliar, slowly building skills to succeed in a new academic system. A family might navigate bureaucratic processes for housing, healthcare, and employment, learning patience and resourcefulness along the way. Each small effort, repeated over time, contributed to the city's larger transformation. The fall of the wall also reshaped perceptions of human potential and collective action. Citizens learned that systems of control, no matter how entrenched, could be changed through consistent effort and the accumulation of small acts of resistance and adaptation. The wall itself, once a symbol of division and constraint, became a testament to the effectiveness of persistent action over time. The narrative of Berlin reinforces the idea that meaningful change does not occur overnight, but is the result of steady, repeated, and coordinated human effort. Integration of social institutions further emphasized this lesson. Hospitals, public services, and civic organizations worked to serve all citizens equally, creating systems that reflected the unified city's needs. Over time, repeated collaboration and shared responsibility helped overcome lingering divisions. Policies were adjusted, services improved, and practices harmonized, creating a more cohesive and functional urban environment. This gradual process illustrated the broader theme that lasting outcomes are produced through persistent, coordinated action over time rather than immediate or dramatic interventions. In the educational realm, curricula were revised to reflect both historical experiences and the contemporary realities of a unified Berlin. Students learned about the wall, its impact on daily life, and the stories of those who had lived through it. Lessons emphasized the cumulative effect of individual and collective action in shaping historical events. Teachers encouraged discussions about resilience, persistence, and the ways in which small actions contribute to larger outcomes. Over years of repeated instruction and reflection, younger generations internalized these lessons, ensuring that the story of the wall's fall would continue to inform both personal and civic understanding. Cultural initiatives also reinforced these themes. Public art projects, exhibitions, and performances highlighted stories of resistance, adaptation, and perseverance. Citizens participated in the creation and interpretation of cultural works, contributing their own experiences and insights. Through repeated engagement, the community collectively reinforced the lesson that transformation is gradual, requires sustained effort and emerges from the accumulation of many small actions. The rebuilding of physical infrastructure mirrored the reconstruction of social and cultural life. Roads, public spaces, and transportation systems were redesigned to integrate former divisions. Buildings were renovated or rebuilt to meet contemporary standards, reflecting the combined contributions of government planning, private enterprise, and citizen initiative. Each improvement, whether small or large, represented the gradual progress that defined Berlin's post-wall transformation. Stories of courage and persistence continued to emerge in everyday life. Individuals recounted their experiences of maintaining hope under restrictive conditions, finding creative solutions to challenges, or quietly advocating for change. These personal narratives reinforced the central lesson that the fall of the wall was not simply a singular event, but the result of decades of patient, persistent effort by countless ordinary people. The accumulation of these small actions created the conditions in which dramatic change could occur. As Berlin slowly transformed after the fall of the wall, one could observe the subtle shifts in the rhythms of daily life. People who had lived under the constraints of division learned to navigate the possibilities of a united city. Markets opened more widely, allowing for a greater variety of goods. Cafes and public squares that had once served only one part of the city welcomed new faces, stories, and exchanges. Simple activities, like taking a walk through a neighborhood, became acts of discovery as citizens explored areas that had previously been restricted. These moments, repeated countless times by thousands of people, reinforced the sense of newfound freedom and the ongoing process of integration. Rebuilding social networks took patience. Families who had been separated for decades rediscovered each other slowly, and sometimes with hesitation. Conversations were careful at first, as people tried to reconcile memories of separation with the realities of reunion. Communities that had developed their own norms, habits, and routines during the division faced the challenge of merging those practices with their neighbors. Schools played a central role in facilitating understanding, encouraging students to collaborate, communicate, and share experiences from both sides. Over time, these repeated interactions built trust and fostered shared identity. The economy, too, required persistent effort to integrate. Former East Berliners entered a system shaped by competition, private enterprise, and market principles that were unfamiliar to many. Jobs required retraining, businesses needed new resources, and the flow of goods and services had to be coordinated across formerly divided neighborhoods. Citizens who adapted, learned, and persevered contributed incrementally to the economic growth and stability of the unified city. Their cumulative efforts gradually reduced disparities and helped create a shared economic reality. Political and administrative systems had to adjust in parallel. Laws and regulations from East Germany had to be harmonized with those of the Federal Republic. Local governments negotiated policies to ensure fairness and continuity, and public institutions worked to integrate services across the former divide. Each administrative adjustment was incremental, building on the previous step, and required patience, careful attention, and sustained collaboration. The city's governance itself became an example of how gradual, persistent effort leads to meaningful change. Cultural life in Berlin flourished as communities learned to reconnect. Art, music, and literature became bridges between former East and West Berliners. Museums documented the history of the wall, showcasing the personal stories of those who lived under its shadow. Exhibitions and performances offered opportunities for dialogue, allowing citizens to learn from one another and to process shared history collectively. Over time, these repeated cultural engagements helped transform the city's social fabric, illustrating how patient, continuous effort fosters understanding and unity. The psychological legacy of the wall was profound, yet slowly it began to shift. East Berliners had internalized years of surveillance, control, and limitation, while West Berliners carried expectations formed in relative freedom. Integration required both groups to adapt and learn from each other. Public forums, social programs, and community events offered spaces for discussion and mutual understanding. Every repeated interaction, every shared story, reinforced a growing sense of common identity. The rebuilding of trust was gradual, but it was steady, persistent, and ultimately transformative. The theme of persistence is central to understanding the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent reunification of the city. The wall itself, though imposing, could not withstand the consistent pressure of human determination over decades. Citizens engaged in countless small acts of resistance, adaptation, and hope, listening to outside broadcasts, sharing forbidden knowledge, or quietly supporting one another. These actions, repeated and accumulated over time, created the conditions for monumental change. The opening of the wall was not the start of transformation, but the visible culmination of persistent efforts spanning decades. Economic and social programs emphasized the long-term nature of integration. Training initiatives, infrastructure projects, and public services were implemented gradually, reflecting an understanding that lasting improvement is achieved step by step. Citizens participated actively, contributing their labor, knowledge, and skills to shape the unified city. Each small action, repeated consistently, created momentum that transformed neighborhoods, communities, and institutions. The city itself became a living example of how cumulative effort can overcome even the most entrenched barriers. Education continued to play a vital role. Teachers incorporated lessons about the wall's history, emphasizing both factual events and the broader theme of persistence. Students learned how decades of patient, consistent effort by ordinary people could produce extraordinary historical outcomes. School projects, collaborative assignments, and discussions fostered empathy and understanding, ensuring that younger generations internalized the lesson that change requires sustained commitment over time. Public commemoration reinforced this theme. Annual events, museum exhibits, and memorials highlighted the stories of those who had lived under division, documenting their experiences and acts of persistence. Citizens participated in creating and interpreting these commemorations, ensuring that the history of the wall remained vivid, tangible, and instructive. These repeated acts of remembrance reinforced the understanding that meaningful change is the product of cumulative effort. The fall of the wall also reshaped Berliners' understanding of human potential. Ordinary individuals discovered the impact of their own persistence, recognizing that their choices, actions, and decisions could influence outcomes far beyond their immediate circumstances. The story of Berlin became a testament to the idea that individual and collective determination, consistently applied over time, can overcome obstacles that initially seem insurmountable. Even in the physical reconstruction of the city, this principle was evident. Roads, bridges, and public spaces were redesigned and rebuilt to integrate formerly divided neighborhoods. Buildings were restored, modernized, or reconstructed, reflecting both historical continuity and contemporary needs. Every construction project, no matter how small, symbolized incremental progress. Each improvement, combined with the efforts of countless residents, reinforced the theme of persistent, cumulative transformation. Individual stories further illustrate the power of persistence. A young teacher in the former East might spend years helping students adapt to a unified education system. A business owner could dedicate effort to retraining employees and navigating new regulations. Families adapted their routines, rebuilt social networks, and cultivated relationships across the former divide. Each act, repeated over months and years, contributed to the broader transformation of the city and reinforced the lesson that meaningful change is incremental and sustained. Cultural initiatives continued to bridge social and historical divides. Public art, theater, and music drew participation from citizens across the former East and West. Exhibitions highlighted narratives of resilience, adaptation, and courage, Each project, repeated and sustained, strengthened the collective memory and understanding of Berlin's history. By actively engaging with these stories, residents participated in the ongoing process of reconciliation and unity, reinforcing the long-term theme that persistent human effort is transformative. The city's institutions also reflected this ongoing process. Hospitals, government offices, schools, and community centers adjusted to serve all citizens equitably, harmonizing practices and policies. These incremental changes, repeated over time, improved efficiency, fairness, and cohesion. Citizens observed that small, consistent actions within institutions could create meaningful impact, reinforcing the broader lesson that persistent effort shapes outcomes at both individual and collective levels. Stories of courage and creativity continued to emerge. People recounted moments of defiance, quiet resistance, or resourcefulness during the years of division. These narratives emphasize that change is often the result of accumulated acts, each small on its own but collectively powerful. The fall of the wall and the transformation of Berlin afterward demonstrates that persistent effort, across many individuals and over long periods, can overcome barriers that appear unyielding. The integration of society required repeated efforts to build trust and understanding. Neighborhood associations, community programs, and cultural events created opportunities for dialogue and collaboration. Over time, citizens came to see each other not as strangers from a divided past, but as partners in shaping a shared future. The slow, consistent process of engagement underscored the central lesson of Berlin's history. Lasting transformation requires persistent action and collaboration over time. Even decades after the wall fell, Berlin continues to embody this theme. The city's identity is shaped by its history of division and reunification, and residents recognize the importance of patient, consistent effort in building and maintaining unity. Historical education emphasizes stories of ordinary citizens, highlighting the accumulation of small acts that collectively produced monumental change. Memorials and preserved sections of the wall provide tangible reminders of both the obstacles and the perseverance required to overcome them. The fall of the Berlin Wall also offers insight into broader human dynamics. Governments can impose rules, walls, and surveillance, but the underlying desire for freedom, connection, and dignity persists. When individuals consistently act upon these desires, even through small or quiet means, they create pressure for change that can eventually reshape society. The story of Berlin demonstrates that incremental, persistent effort is often more effective than abrupt or forceful confrontation in producing lasting transformation. In the years that followed the wall's fall, Berlin became a city in constant motion, not just physically, but socially, culturally, and psychologically. Streets that had once been divided by checkpoints and barbed wire were now filled with movement and conversation. Children who had grown up knowing only one half of the city now explored both, discovering parks, schools, and neighborhoods they had only heard about in stories. Families visited relatives who had been separated for decades, sharing meals and rebuilding bonds with care, patience, and sometimes a quiet sense of awe. These reunions were gradual. Relationships did not automatically resume where they had left off. They had to be nurtured, rebuilt over months and years, step by step. Work and employment were another realm where Berliners experienced gradual transformation. Citizens from the former East entered a market-driven economy that was both unfamiliar and challenging. Jobs that had been secure in state-run industries now required adaptation, retraining, and flexibility. Many East Berliners enrolled in vocational programs, sought apprenticeships, or pursued higher education to adjust to new expectations. Over time, these individual acts of persistence contributed to the larger economic stabilization of the city. Former West Berliners also adjusted, finding ways to integrate colleagues and neighbors into workplaces that had previously operated under different systems. The cumulative impact of these repeated efforts shaped an economy that reflected the shared reality of a unified Berlin. Education was a particularly vital area of integration. Schools blended students from East and West, combining different curricula, teaching methods, and expectations. Teachers devoted themselves to fostering understanding and cohesion, guiding students to collaborate, communicate, and learn from each other. Repeated classroom projects, discussions, and shared experiences cultivated empathy and a sense of shared identity among young citizens. Over time, the cumulative effect of these efforts helped bridge social and cultural divides, demonstrating the long-term power of persistence in shaping society. Cultural life flourished in ways that had been impossible before. Museums, theaters, and galleries offered exhibitions highlighting the stories of life under the wall, resistance, escape, and daily survival. Music and theater performances brought people together across the former divide, allowing them to engage in shared cultural experiences. Festivals and public events provided spaces for dialogue and connection, encouraging citizens to discover common ground. Through repeated participation in these cultural activities, Berliners gradually reshaped their collective identity, embracing a history of division while creating a sense of unity and resilience. Psychological healing was slower, but equally essential. Citizens who had grown accustomed to surveillance, restriction, and control had to learn how to exercise autonomy and confidence in a new social environment. West Berliners, too, adjusted to living alongside neighbors whose experiences had been shaped by decades of restriction and uncertainty. Counseling, community programs, and informal social networks played a role in facilitating this adjustment. Each interaction, conversation, and collaborative activity contributed incrementally to a sense of shared trust and mutual understanding. Even the physical city continued to bear the imprint of its divided past. Sections of the wall were preserved as historical markers, while other areas were cleared for redevelopment. Parks, pedestrian zones, and new infrastructure projects emerged on former borderlands. Residents participated actively in these projects, contributing labor, ideas, and cooperation. Each act of rebuilding, no matter how small, reinforced the broader theme that persistent, repeated human effort can reshape the physical and social landscape over time. The story of Berlin's reintegration was not merely about rebuilding infrastructure, but about reconstructing a sense of community and identity. Neighborhoods in the former East had developed unique social patterns and habits under state control, while West Berlin had cultivated a culture of autonomy and openness. As citizens from both sides interacted, shared spaces, and participated in joint initiatives, they gradually built a shared civic identity. These repeated engagements, often mundane but consistent, allowed trust and cooperation to grow. Over years, the cumulative effect created a city that was both united and aware of its diverse past. Political life also adapted gradually. The unification of laws, governance structures, and civic services required negotiation, planning, and patience. Local governments coordinated efforts to provide public services equitably across former boundaries. Social programs were implemented to address disparities in health, education, and employment. Each incremental change, carefully planned and executed, contributed to a more cohesive and functional urban society. The integration of political and administrative systems exemplified the principle that sustained, cumulative effort yields lasting outcomes. Individual narratives continued to highlight the importance of persistence. Families recounted stories of maintaining hope, finding creative solutions to challenges, and quietly advocating for change over decades. Teachers shared accounts of students adapting to new educational systems, gradually building confidence and skills. Workers described retraining, learning new trades, and helping colleagues from different backgrounds adjust to shared workplaces. Each personal story illustrated the broader historical lesson: monumental change is the product of countless small, repeated acts of courage, adaptation, and persistence. The fall of the Berlin Wall also reshaped the city's approach to collective memory and commemoration. Public spaces became sites of education and reflection. Museums documented personal and collective stories, preserving artifacts, photographs, and testimonies. Annual ceremonies and public discussions ensured that citizens remained connected to the lessons of history. Participation in these activities was itself a form of persistent engagement, reminding both residents and visitors that lasting change requires active reflection, understanding, and repeated reinforcement. Cultural initiatives further reinforced the central theme. Public art projects, theatre productions, and literary programs often drew on the experiences of those who lived through the division. Residents contributed their own narratives, creating works that blended personal memory with communal experience. Through repeated involvement, citizens internalized lessons about resilience, persistence, and the cumulative effect of individual actions. These activities also fostered dialogue between generations, ensuring that the knowledge and experience of the past informed the behavior and values of the future. As Berlin matured into a fully integrated city, the cumulative impact of persistent human effort became evident in tangible ways. Neighborhoods that had once been isolated were now vibrant centers of commerce, culture, and community life. Schools, hospitals, and civic institutions operated efficiently across former divisions. Public spaces hosted festivals, markets, and performances that brought together citizens from diverse backgrounds. The physical, social, and cultural transformation of Berlin illustrated the central lessons are sustained. Incremental effort produces profound and lasting change. Economic development mirrored these social transformations. Entrepreneurs, workers, and business owners contributed to the city's growth by applying their skills, adapting to new systems, and collaborating with one another. Former East Berliners invested time in learning new trades and expanding professional opportunities, while West Berliners shared expertise, capital, and networks. Over years of patient effort, these individual contributions accumulated into tangible economic progress, bridging disparities and fostering prosperity across the city. Education remained a critical mechanism for transmitting the lessons of the wall's fall and the value of persistence. Students studied the history of division, the human experiences of daily life under the wall, and the stories of those who worked for change. Lessons emphasized the accumulation of small, consistent efforts over time and the importance of human determination in shaping outcomes. By integrating these teachings into the curriculum, educators ensured that younger generations would understand both the historical facts and the underlying principles that had led to transformation. Neighborhood engagement also reinforced the theme of persistence. Residents participated in community programs, volunteer initiatives, and local planning efforts. Small, repeated actions, organizing a neighborhood cleanup, participating in a town hall meeting, or mentoring a child, collectively contributed to the city's cohesion. Each individual effort, when repeated and combined with others, reinforced the broader societal transformation initiated by the fall of the wall. The integration of social services highlighted the long-term nature of change. Healthcare systems, public transportation networks, and social welfare programs gradually adapted to serve all citizens equally. Policymakers and practitioners understood that addressing disparities required continuous adjustment, feedback, and patient implementation. Over years, the cumulative effect of these repeated efforts strengthened both the functionality and equity of public institutions, illustrating the principle that persistent action produces lasting impact. Psychological and emotional healing remained ongoing. Citizens who had lived under state surveillance and control required time to rebuild confidence and trust. West Berliners needed to adjust to the experiences of their eastern neighbors. Community centers, counseling programs, and informal social networks provided spaces for reflection and dialogue. These repeated acts of interaction, empathy, and support gradually repaired the psychological impact of division, reinforcing the broader lesson that patience and persistence are essential for transformation at both individual and societal levels. Cultural memory continued to play a central role in reinforcing understanding. Exhibitions, public lectures, and artistic performances emphasized stories of resistance, adaptation, and hope. Citizens engaged repeatedly with these narratives, integrating them into personal and communal understanding. The wall's history became a lens through which residents could understand the power of human effort, the accumulation of small actions, and the eventual capacity for monumental change. Even decades after the fall of the wall, Berliners remained connected to these lessons. Preserved sections of the wall, museums, and public art installations served as reminders of both the obstacles and the persistence required to overcome them. Citizens of all ages participated in commemorative events, educational programs, and community discussions, ensuring that the values embedded in Berlin's history, the importance of persistence, resilience, and collective effort, remained alive in the city's culture. The fall of the Berlin Wall is often remembered as a single night of celebration, but the deeper truth is that it was the culmination of decades of incremental action. Citizens maintained hope, resisted quietly, adapted creatively, and persisted despite challenges. Governments, institutions, and individuals all contributed in small ways that, over time, led to transformation. The wall's collapse was not an isolated event, but the visible outcome of countless repeated efforts, demonstrating the enduring power of persistence in shaping history. As Berlin moved deeper into reunification, the everyday routines of its citizens reflected subtle but profound shifts. Streets that had once been impassable barriers now carried the footsteps of people reconnecting with family, friends, and neighbors. Shops in the former East gradually adapted to new supply chains, opening shelves to products that had previously been unavailable. Markets thrived with a blend of East and West German goods, illustrating the slow but steady integration of economic systems. People learned not just to navigate new infrastructure, but to adapt to a new rhythm of daily life shaped by freedom, opportunity, and the challenges of unity. The integration of neighborhoods required patience. Families who had been separated by decades of division faced emotional complexity as they rebuilt connections. Parents who had lost contact with children or siblings spent months, sometimes years, navigating both practical and emotional challenges to reunite. Conversations were careful, exploring shared memories and acknowledging different experiences. Neighborhoods, which had operated with distinct social norms during division, now learned to collaborate in community initiatives, school programs, and cultural events. Each small act of cooperation contributed incrementally to a sense of cohesion and shared identity, demonstrating that social unity is a process, not an instant achievement. Employment and economic life mirrored these incremental transformations. Former East Berliners entered a market economy that was unfamiliar and demanding. Jobs that had once been secured now required new skills, flexibility, and adaptation to competitive conditions. Many workers enrolled in vocational programs, pursued higher education, or trained in new trades. Over time, these individual efforts accumulated into tangible improvements in employment, economic stability, and professional opportunity. Former West Berliners also adapted to integrating colleagues and neighbors from the East, creating workplaces that blended different cultural expectations and experiences. The slow, persistent process of economic integration reflected a larger principle: cumulative, sustained effort can overcome long-standing systemic disparities. Education continued to play a pivotal role. Schools integrated students from both sides, blending curricula, teaching practices, and social expectations. Teachers dedicated themselves to fostering collaboration, empathy, and shared understanding. Classroom projects encouraged communication, teamwork, and exposure to diverse perspectives. Over months and years, repeated efforts in education nurtured a generation that could appreciate both the challenges of division and the possibilities of unity. Students internalize the lesson that personal effort, patience, and collaboration are central to shaping outcomes in complex social systems. Cultural life became both a mirror and a bridge. Museums, galleries, and theaters explored the experiences of life under the wall, escape attempts, and acts of quiet resistance. Music and performing arts created spaces where East and West Berliners could meet, collaborate, and engage in shared reflection. Public festivals and cultural celebrations allowed citizens to experience unity firsthand, fostering a sense of collective identity that transcended the historical divisions. Over time, repeated participation in these activities contributed to a subtle but profound transformation of social attitudes, demonstrating the enduring power of cumulative action in shaping both perception and reality. The psychological legacy of decades of division demanded careful attention. Citizens from the East had internalized habits of caution, self-monitoring, and limited expression. Those from the West, though accustomed to relative freedom, had to understand and respect the lived experiences of their Eastern neighbors. Community centers, counseling programs, and informal social networks facilitated dialogue, trust building, and gradual emotional integration. Each repeated interaction, conversation, or act of collaboration strengthened the psychological cohesion of the city, reinforcing the principle that long-term persistence is necessary to rebuild not only physical structures but human connections. The persistence theme also emerged clearly in political and administrative integration. East German laws, institutions, and bureaucratic practices needed harmonization with those of the Federal Republic. Policymakers, administrators, and citizens collaborated in iterative processes to ensure fairness, continuity, and functional governance. Policies addressing healthcare, education, employment, and infrastructure were implemented gradually, often revised multiple times to meet the needs of a diverse population. These repeated, incremental actions created a stable governance system that reflected the cumulative power of patient, persistent effort. Stories of individual perseverance continued to define the post-war era. Citizens recounted small but meaningful acts of resilience during the years of division, sharing forbidden information, maintaining secret communication channels, or finding ways to connect with distant family. After the wall fell, people applied the same persistence to rebuilding their lives, adjusting to new jobs, learning new systems, and creating new networks. Teachers, artists, business owners, and community organizers all contributed to the gradual rebuilding of social cohesion, each effort small in isolation but powerful when accumulated over time. Cultural memory played a critical role in sustaining lessons of persistence. Exhibitions, theater performances, and public art installations highlighted both personal and collective experiences of life with the wall. Residents actively participated in these projects, contributing stories, artifacts, and reflections. By repeatedly engaging with these narratives, citizens strengthened their understanding of resilience, adaptation, and the impact of cumulative action. Cultural memory thus became a living process, reinforcing social cohesion and collective identity across generations. The physical reconstruction of Berlin mirrored these social and cultural transformations. Former borderlands, once dominated by concrete barriers and watchtowers, were repurposed as parks, pedestrian zones, and mixed-use neighborhoods. Infrastructure improvements connected previously isolated areas, creating a city that was physically integrated as well as socially connected. Residents participated directly in redevelopment, whether through volunteer work, public consultations, or contributions to community planning. Each incremental act of reconstruction reinforced the principle that persistent, repeated action shapes both tangible and intangible outcomes. Economic revitalization continued over decades, with persistent effort at both the individual and institutional levels. Entrepreneurs, workers, and policymakers collaborated to rebuild markets, businesses, and industries that had been constrained under state control. East Berliners invested in retraining, skill building, and enterprise development, while West Berliners contributed experience, mentorship, and resources. Over time, these repeated efforts produced measurable economic improvements, narrowing disparities, and creating shared opportunity across the city. The story of Berlin's economic integration demonstrates the long-term power of cumulative human effort. Education remained a central mechanism for transmitting both historical knowledge and practical lessons about persistence. Students learned about the wall, its impact on daily life, and the small but consistent acts that contributed to change. Teachers emphasized that monumental historical outcomes emerge from repeated actions over time. Through classroom projects, collaborative exercises, and discussions, younger generations internalized the lesson that patient, sustained effort can overcome obstacles that initially appear immovable. Neighborhood engagement reinforced these principles in everyday life. Residents participated in community programs, volunteer initiatives, and local decision-making, contributing incrementally to social cohesion. Small, repeated actions, organizing local events, mentoring children, maintaining public spaces, strengthened the fabric of civic life. Each individual act, when combined with countless others, contributed to a city that was increasingly unified, resilient, and adaptable. Berlin became a living example of how persistence, repeated over time, can reshape both society and culture. Even decades after the fall of the wall, Berlin's identity remained tied to this history of persistence. Preserved sections of the wall, museums, and memorials served as reminders of both the obstacles overcome and the cumulative effort required to achieve freedom and unity. Citizens engaged in commemorative activities, education, and cultural events, ensuring that the lessons of history remained alive and relevant. These repeated acts of memory reinforced the understanding that transformation is not instantaneous, but emerges through patient, consistent engagement. The fall of the Berlin Wall also reshaped international understanding of social and political change. Neighboring countries observed the peaceful integration of Berlin, recognizing the effectiveness of sustained citizen engagement, dialogue, and persistent adaptation in achieving systemic transformation. Policymakers and scholars drew lessons from Berlin, understanding that gradual, cumulative effort is often more effective than abrupt or violent intervention in producing lasting change. Personal stories from post-wall Berlin illustrate the central theme vividly. A teacher worked for years to integrate students from both sides, fostering understanding and collaboration. A young professional retrained to meet the demands of a new economy. Families rebuilt routines, navigated bureaucratic processes, and strengthened social networks. Artists and community organizers contributed small but meaningful projects that collectively shaped public life. Each repeated, patient action reinforced the larger transformation, demonstrating that persistent human effort accumulates into historical change. Cultural engagement remained a vital tool for reinforcing unity. Public art projects, exhibitions, and performances highlighted stories of resistance, adaptation, and resilience. Residents actively contributed their own experiences, creating collective works that reflected both personal memory and communal history. Over time, these repeated acts fostered understanding, empathy, and shared identity. Cultural participation, like other incremental efforts, demonstrated the long-term power of persistence in shaping society. Berlin's social institutions reflected the same pattern of incremental transformation. Hospitals, schools, government offices, and civic organizations adjusted their practices to serve all citizens equitably. Policies were implemented gradually, continuously refined, and adapted to meet the needs of a diverse population. Over years of repeated action and adjustment, the city achieved functional cohesion, equity, and stability. Each small administrative decision, each policy adjustment, contributed to the broader lesson that lasting change is the product of sustained, deliberate effort. The psychological adjustment of Berliners continued alongside these structural changes. Citizens who had lived under surveillance and restriction gradually learned to navigate autonomy, confidence, and trust in the new social environment. West Berliners also adjusted, learning to understand and respect experiences that had been shaped by decades of control. Counseling, community programs, and informal social networks provided repeated opportunities for dialogue, support, and adaptation. Over time, these cumulative efforts repaired the emotional and psychological impact of division, reinforcing the broader lesson that transformation requires persistent human engagement. In the decades following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the city's life unfolded in layers, quietly and persistently. Streets that had once been symbolic lines of separation became places of connection and discovery. Families reunited in neighborhoods where children now ran freely, exploring playgrounds, schools, and parks that were once inaccessible. Markets in formerly divided districts began to feature a mix of goods, blending East and West products in ways that reflected not just economic integration, but also cultural exchange. Each daily interaction, whether in a shop, at a bus stop, or along the streets, reinforced the slow stitching together of a city that had been torn apart for decades. Neighborhoods became laboratories for social adaptation. Families and neighbors, long separated by walls and checkpoints, learned to communicate and coexist. Community meetings, school initiatives, and local projects provided spaces where residents could engage in dialogue, resolve conflicts, and collaborate on shared goals. These repeated interactions were not dramatic or sensational, yet they formed the backbone of social cohesion. The slow accumulation of small acts of understanding, compromise, and cooperation gradually transformed the social landscape. Berliners came to recognize that rebuilding community requires time, patience, and persistence, and that lasting unity is cultivated through countless small, everyday acts. Economic life, too, reflected the cumulative effects of patient effort. Former East Berliners faced the challenge of adapting to a capitalist system that was unfamiliar and sometimes daunting. Jobs required retraining, and business practices demanded flexibility, learning, and creativity. Many individuals enrolled in vocational programs, sought mentorship from West Berlin colleagues, or started their own enterprises. Over years, these repeated efforts produced tangible economic progress, narrowing gaps between East and West. Meanwhile, West Berliners engaged in mentoring, partnership, and collaboration, facilitating integration. The city's economy gradually stabilized, demonstrating that persistent effort over time can produce systemic change. Education continued to play a vital role in fostering cohesion. Schools merged students from East and West, combining curricula, teaching practices, and social expectations. Teachers worked tirelessly to guide students through the complexities of their shared history while preparing them for a unified future. Classroom projects, group activities, and collaborative exercises became the threads that wove young people together across formerly rigid divides. Over time, these repeated educational experiences created a generation capable of understanding both historical division and the practical realities of integration. The cumulative impact of persistent educational effort reinforced the city's ongoing transformation. Cultural life became both a reflection and a catalyst of unity. Museums, galleries, and performance spaces chronicled the experiences of life under the wall, acts of resistance, and stories of everyday survival. Music, theatre, and festivals created spaces where citizens from different backgrounds could meet, collaborate, and connect. Through repeated participation in cultural events, Berliners learned to appreciate shared history, discover common values, and build a collective identity. Culture became an active process of integration, reinforcing the broader theme that gradual, repeated effort leads to profound social transformation. The psychological and emotional adaptation of Berliners was another slow, persistent process. Citizens who had lived under surveillance, control, and restriction needed time to exercise autonomy and rebuild confidence. West Berliners, accustomed to freedom and opportunity, needed to understand the unique experiences of their Eastern neighbors. Community programs, counseling initiatives, and informal networks created spaces for dialogue, trust building, and emotional adjustment. Each conversation, each shared experience, contributed incrementally to psychological healing, demonstrating the cumulative power of persistent human engagement in shaping society. Political and administrative integration required similar patience and dedication. Laws, regulations, and bureaucratic systems from the East had to be harmonized with those of the Federal Republic. Local governments, administrators, and citizens collaborated in iterative processes to ensure fairness, continuity, and functionality. Public services, healthcare systems, and civic institutions gradually adapted to serve all residents equitably. Each incremental reform, each policy revision reflected the importance of repeated, sustained effort in creating functional governance. Berlin's political reintegration illustrated that systemic change is rarely instantaneous, but the result of persistent and deliberate action. Individual narratives highlighted the human dimension of this transformation. Teachers described students who adapted gradually to a unified education system, learning to collaborate across differences. Workers recounted retraining, learning new trades, and integrating with colleagues from different backgrounds. Families rebuilt routines, maintained connections, and navigated bureaucratic complexities over years. Artists, writers, and cultural organizers contributed creative works that reflected shared experience and resilience. Each act, though small in isolation, accumulated to create social, cultural, and economic transformation across the city. Cultural memory reinforced these lessons of persistence. Museums, memorials, and art installations chronicled both personal and collective stories of life under the wall. Citizens actively engaged with these narratives, contributing their own memories, experiences, and reflections. Repeated engagement with history helped residents internalize lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the power of sustained effort. Cultural participation became a form of civic education, teaching generations that monumental outcomes often emerge from incremental actions over long periods. Physical reconstruction mirrored these social and cultural transformations. Former border zones, once dominated by concrete barriers and watchtowers, were repurposed for public spaces, housing, and infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and pedestrian zones connected previously isolated neighborhoods. Citizens contributed to redevelopment through volunteer initiatives, consultations, and community planning. Each small act of rebuilding, repeated across neighborhoods and years, reinforced the principle that persistent effort transforms both the physical and social landscape. Economic integration continued to benefit from the accumulation of small, consistent actions. Entrepreneurs, workers, and policymakers collaborated to rebuild markets and industries that had been constrained under state control. East Berliners invested in education, retraining, and enterprise development. West Berliners contributed experience, mentorship, and capital. Over decades, these efforts produced measurable economic progress, narrowing disparities and fostering opportunity. The economic story of Berlin demonstrates the long-term impact of persistent, incremental human action. Education remained a mechanism for both knowledge transfer and value formation. Students studied the history of the wall, daily life under division, and the small acts that collectively led to change. Lessons emphasized that monumental historical outcomes emerge from persistent, repeated actions. Classroom exercises, collaborative projects, and discussions reinforced understanding, ensuring that younger generations internalize the importance of patience, perseverance, and consistent effort. Neighborhood engagement was another domain where persistent action shaped the city. Residents participated in community programs, volunteer initiatives, and local decision-making. Small, repeated contributions, cleaning public spaces, mentoring children, attending meetings, accumulated to produce meaningful social cohesion. Each individual effort, though modest, combined with the efforts of others to strengthen the city's fabric, demonstrating that long-term transformation depends on the sum of small, persistent actions. Even decades after the wall fell, Berliners remained engaged with its lessons. Preserved sections, memorials, and museums served as reminders of both past obstacles and the cumulative effort required to overcome them. Citizens of all ages participated in educational programs, commemorative events, and cultural initiatives, ensuring that the lessons of resilience, patience, and persistence remained relevant. These repeated acts of engagement reinforced the broader understanding that societal transformation is gradual, cumulative, and requires sustained effort. Internationally, Berlin's experience provided a model of transformation through persistence. Neighboring nations and global observers recognized the effectiveness of patient engagement, dialogue, and cumulative action in achieving systemic change. Scholars, policymakers, and civic leaders studied the city as a case study of how individual and collective persistence can overcome entrenched barriers without resorting to violent upheaval. Berlin's story became emblematic of the principle that enduring change is the result of sustained, repeated effort. Personal stories from post-war Berlin illustrated these principles in everyday life. A teacher spent years guiding students across differences in background and experience. A worker retrained to meet new economic demands. Families rebuilt social networks and adapted to new opportunities and expectations. Artists, musicians, and writers contributed to cultural life, blending memories of the past with visions for a shared future. Each act, repeated and reinforced over time, demonstrated the cumulative power of human effort in shaping both individual lives and broader society. Cultural engagement remained central to the ongoing transformation. Public art projects, performances, and exhibitions drew citizens from both former sides, highlighting resilience, adaptation, and collaboration. Residents contributed personal experiences to collective narratives, reinforcing empathy, understanding, and shared identity. Over time, these repeated engagements created a culture of reflection and connection, demonstrating that persistent effort is essential for both social cohesion and historical consciousness. Berlin's institutions also reflected the importance of sustained action. Hospitals, schools, civic organizations, and government offices adapted incrementally to serve all residents equitably. Policies were refined, programs implemented, and services improved through repeated assessment and adjustment. Over years of persistent effort, these incremental changes strengthened the city's functionality, fairness, and cohesion. Berlin's institutional evolution exemplified the principle that lasting transformation is built on cumulative, deliberate action rather than sudden change. The psychological integration of the population remained an ongoing process. Citizens who had lived under restriction gradually learned to exercise autonomy and trust. West Berliners adapted to the lived experiences of their eastern neighbors. Counseling, social programs, and community initiatives provided repeated opportunities for dialogue, understanding, and emotional adjustment. Through these persistent interactions, citizens gradually repaired the psychological legacy of division, reinforcing the broader principle that long-term social transformation requires continuous, patient engagement. In the years following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rhythm of life in the city took on a new cadence, slow and deliberate, shaped by the careful rebuilding of both structures and relationships. Streets that had once been lines of division became avenues of discovery, filled with the movement of pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicles connecting formerly isolated neighborhoods. Families, some reunited for the first time in decades, took small steps toward rebuilding bonds. Conversations were cautious at first, as people navigated the emotional complexities of reconnection. Over time, repeated interactions, sharing meals, visiting neighbors, attending community events, allowed trust and familiarity to grow. These small, consistent acts gradually transformed neighborhoods into spaces of cohesion and shared identity. Economic integration proceeded in a similarly incremental fashion. Former East Berliners faced the challenge of adapting to a market-driven system that operated according to different principles than those they had known. Jobs that had once been stable under state control now required flexibility, new skills, and adaptation to competition. Citizens invested time in vocational training, apprenticeships, and higher education. They learned to navigate bureaucratic processes, access credit, and participate in private enterprise. Former West Berliners contributed mentorship, resources, and collaboration, creating an ecosystem where small, persistent efforts collectively shaped a thriving urban economy. Each incremental step in employment, business, and industry contributed to the city's long-term economic stability and integration. Education served as one of the most effective tools for fostering unity and understanding. Schools combined students from East and West, integrating curricula, teaching practices, and social expectations. Teachers guided students through the challenges of collaboration, encouraging empathy and shared responsibility. Projects, group activities, and joint assignments helped young people understand both the historical context of the wall and the practical realities of life in a unified city. Over repeated engagements, students developed the ability to navigate social and cultural differences, learning that the accumulation of small, patient efforts creates meaningful transformation. Education became a quiet but persistent engine of integration, shaping the city's future through the deliberate cultivation of knowledge, empathy, and cooperation. Cultural initiatives played an equally vital role. Museums, galleries, theaters, and concert halls curated exhibitions and performances that highlighted life under the wall, acts of resistance, and stories of ordinary citizens who persisted despite adversity. Public art projects transformed previously restricted spaces into sites of reflection, creativity, and engagement. Festivals and community events provided opportunities for interaction and collaboration across former divisions. Through repeated participation in cultural life, Berliners internalized lessons about resilience, persistence, and the cumulative impact of individual and collective effort. Culture became not just a reflection of history, but an active force in shaping social cohesion. The psychological adjustment of Berliners was slower and less visible, but equally crucial. Citizens from the East had internalized habits of caution, self-monitoring, and limited agency. West Berliners, accustomed to freedom and opportunity, had to understand the lived experiences of their Eastern neighbors. Counseling services, community centers, and informal social networks provided repeated opportunities for dialogue, empathy, and trust building. Each conversation, each shared story, and each cooperative effort contributed incrementally to emotional healing. Over time, these persistent acts reinforced the social cohesion necessary for the city's broader transformation. Political and administrative integration demanded meticulous, sustained effort. Laws, regulations, and bureaucratic systems from East Germany had to be harmonized with those of the Federal Republic. Local governments, civil servants, and citizens engaged in iterative processes to ensure equitable policies, functional governance, and continuity of services. Public programs in healthcare, education, housing, and employment were implemented gradually, adjusted repeatedly, and refined based on feedback and experience. Each small administrative act reinforced the principle that systemic, lasting change arises from cumulative, persistent effort. Berlin's governance became a living example of the way patient, sustained work produces durable results. Individual narratives illuminated the broader transformation in personal, tangible terms. Teachers described the gradual success of students, bridging divides through collaborative learning. Workers recounted retraining, adapting to new professional environments, and mentoring colleagues from different backgrounds. Families rebuilt routines, navigated bureaucratic hurdles, and nurtured social connections. Artists, writers, and musicians contributed to a cultural ecosystem that blended memory with vision for the future. Each small, consistent act, though unremarkable on its own, accumulated to produce significant social, economic, and cultural transformation. These stories illustrate that historical change is rarely sudden. It emerges from repeated, patient human effort. Cultural memory reinforced lessons about persistence. Museums, memorials, and public art installations chronicled stories of life under the wall, acts of quiet defiance, and gradual adaptation. Citizens participated actively, contributing personal recollections, artifacts, and reflections. Repeated engagement with these narratives helped Berliners internalize lessons about resilience and the cumulative power of small actions. Cultural memory became a tool for reinforcing identity, fostering empathy, and sustaining historical consciousness across generations. The physical reconstruction of Berlin mirrored the broader social and cultural evolution. Former border zones, dominated by concrete barriers, checkpoints, and watchtowers, were transformed into public spaces, housing and infrastructure. Roads and bridges connected previously divided neighborhoods, creating a city that was physically and socially integrated. Residents contributed through volunteer initiatives, consultations, and participation in planning processes. Each incremental step in urban development, when repeated across neighborhoods and years, demonstrated the transformative power of sustained, collective effort. Economic growth continued as a testament to persistent action. Entrepreneurs, workers, and policymakers collaborated to rebuild markets, industries, and enterprises constrained under state control. East Berliners invested in education, skill building, and business ventures. West Berliners contributed mentorship, capital, and networks. Over decades, these repeated efforts produced tangible economic progress, narrowing disparities and fostering shared opportunity. The integration of Berlin's economy illustrates the long-term impact of incremental, persistent human effort on both individual and societal prosperity. Education remained a cornerstone of societal integration and the transmission of historical insight. Students studied the wall, its impact on daily life, and the small actions that cumulatively shaped history. Lessons emphasized the principle that significant change is the product of repeated, consistent effort over time. Classroom projects, collaborative exercises, and group discussions reinforced the lesson that patience, persistence, and cooperation are foundational to lasting transformation. Younger generations internalize these values, preparing them to contribute actively to a unified, resilient city. Neighborhood engagement continued to demonstrate the power of repeated action. Residents participated in volunteer initiatives, civic programs, and community projects. Small acts, maintaining public spaces, organizing local events, mentoring children, combined across years and neighborhoods to foster cohesion. Each contribution, modest in isolation, reinforced the broader transformation of the city. Berlin became a living example of how incremental, persistent effort, repeated across individuals and communities, shapes society over time. Even decades after the fall of the wall, Berliners remained engaged with its lessons. Preserved sections, museums, and memorials reminded citizens of both the obstacles and the persistent effort required to overcome them. Commemorative events, educational programs, and cultural initiatives reinforced the lessons of resilience, perseverance, and cumulative action. These repeated acts of engagement ensured that the principles underpinning Berlin's transformation remained vivid and relevant. International observers noted Berlin's transformation as a model for sustainable change. Scholars, policymakers, and civic leaders studied the city's experience, recognizing the effectiveness of patient engagement, dialogue, and persistent adaptation in achieving long-term social and political outcomes. Berlin's experience illustrated that systemic change is often the product of repeated, incremental human effort rather than sudden or forceful intervention. Personal stories continued to illustrate the central theme. A teacher spent years nurturing collaboration and understanding among students from different backgrounds. A worker retrained and adapted to new professional systems, supporting colleagues along the way. Families rebuilt routines, social networks, and relationships over time. Artists, musicians, and cultural organizers contributed to projects that reflected shared experience and collective resilience. Each small, repeated act demonstrated the cumulative power of persistent human effort in shaping both individual lives and the broader social fabric. Cultural engagement remained vital. Public art projects, exhibitions, and performances drew participants from all parts of the city, emphasizing resilience, adaptation, and collaboration. Residents contributed personal experiences to collective narratives, reinforcing empathy, understanding, and shared identity. Over time, these repeated interactions strengthened social cohesion, illustrating that persistence is essential not only in rebuilding structures, but also in cultivating shared values and cultural continuity. Berlin's institutions reflected the same principle. Hospitals, schools, government offices, and civic organizations adapted incrementally to serve all residents equitably. Policies were revised, programs implemented, and services refined over years of repeated effort. The result was a city with functional, fair, and cohesive institutions. Berlin's evolution demonstrated that meaningful change at both societal and institutional levels is rarely instantaneous. It emerges through patient, consistent, and repeated action. The psychological adaptation of citizens was an ongoing, gradual process. Former East Berliners learned to navigate autonomy, trust, and freedom. West Berliners learned to recognize and respect the lived experiences of their Eastern neighbors. Counseling services, community initiatives, and social programs provided repeated opportunities for dialogue, support, and emotional growth. Over time, these interactions repaired the psychological and social impact of division, reinforcing the broader lesson that sustained persistent effort is essential for enduring transformation. Beyond the streets, neighborhoods, and lives of Berliners, the story of the Berlin Wall's fall was deeply intertwined with the broader currents of international politics. For decades, the wall had stood not only as a physical barrier, but as a symbol of ideological division between East and West, between Soviet influence and Western democracy. The decisions made in capitals thousands of kilometers away, from Moscow to Washington, Bonn to Paris, rippled through Berlin in ways both subtle and profound. Yet even in this larger political theater, the same principle of persistence applied. Decades of small decisions, negotiations, and pressure, both internal and external, culminated in a monumental historical moment. The Soviet Union's shifting priorities played a quiet but decisive role. By the 1980s, economic stagnation, bureaucratic inefficiency, and a growing awareness of technological lag had begun to undermine the cohesion of the Eastern Bloc. Soviet leaders, grappling with internal pressures and the need for reform, gradually allowed satellite states more leeway, creating a space in which citizens could push for change. The policies of openness and restructuring, later known as perestroika and glasnost, introduced a subtle but persistent force for transformation. These policies were not revolutionary in a single moment. They represented repeated, incremental steps toward transparency and reform, setting the stage for the events that would unfold in Berlin. Meanwhile, the populations of Eastern Europe were increasingly restless. Years of restriction had not erased the desire for connection, mobility, and freedom. Across the Eastern Bloc, citizens found ways to express dissent quietly, through underground literature, clandestine meetings, travel requests, and informal networks. These small acts, repeated by millions over decades, created pressure on governments and institutions that could not be ignored. Berlin, as the epicenter of division, became a focal point for these cumulative efforts. Each act of resistance, however subtle, contributed to a broader momentum that eventually reached critical mass. West Germany and the broader Western alliance also played a persistent role. Diplomatic engagement, economic partnerships, and cultural exchange reinforced the values of openness and cooperation. Radio broadcasts and news reporting carried ideas and information across borders, sustaining hope and awareness among citizens in the East. While these interventions were indirect, their repeated presence over decades created a continuous stream of influence that chipped away at the wall's symbolic and practical power. Even when no dramatic events occurred, the persistent flow of knowledge, connection, and alternative perspectives contributed to the conditions necessary for eventual change. By the late 1980s, a convergence of pressures, political, economic, and social, made the wall increasingly unsustainable. Governments faced protests, citizens demanded mobility, and international observers pressed for reform. Yet the collapse of the wall did not emerge from a single dramatic confrontation. Instead, it was the culmination of years of persistent, coordinated effort by both ordinary citizens and state actors responding to repeated pressures and opportunities. The lesson remained consistent. Monumental change often grows quietly, through the accumulation of small, determined actions over time. Within Berlin itself, this external pressure intersected with internal determination. Citizens in East Berlin organized demonstrations, civic forums, and gatherings, testing the limits of tolerance and legality. Over years, these actions built confidence, awareness, and solidarity among the population. Each peaceful protest, each small act of defiance, created a rhythm of persistent engagement that, over time, undermined the wall's authority. The wall's collapse, therefore, was not the result of a single dramatic night. It was the visible outcome of decades of cumulative effort, courage, and perseverance. The international context also influenced the psychological dimension of the wall's fall. Leaders and citizens alike were aware of the scrutiny of the global community. Repeated diplomatic dialogues, media coverage, and citizen activism created a sense of accountability that reinforced the possibility of change. Each conversation, negotiation, and appeal, though often incremental, contributed to a broader momentum that eventually became unstoppable. The persistence of engagement, both internal and external, illustrated a central truth. Lasting change often requires sustained pressure, applied patiently and consistently. Even after the wall fell, the global implications of Berlin's transformation continued to unfold. The city became a symbol, not of a single event, but of the power of persistent human action. Across Europe and the world, governments, activists, and ordinary citizens looked to Berlin as a case study in how gradual, coordinated, and repeated efforts could produce monumental change. Lessons were drawn about diplomacy, social engagement, civic courage, and the capacity of individuals to influence history when acting persistently over time. In the neighborhoods of Berlin, these international forces intersected with local realities. Citizens, emboldened by the shifting geopolitical climate, explored freedoms they had long been denied. Travel, expression, and choice became tangible possibilities. Markets expanded, cultural life flourished, and daily routines reflected the newfound reality of agency and mobility. These changes were not immediate. Each small adjustment, from crossing a previously restricted street to participating in an open forum, was part of a slow but cumulative transformation. Over months and years, these repeated acts reshaped the physical, social, and emotional landscape of the city. Economic adaptation in this period was particularly gradual. Former East Berliners engaged with new systems of commerce, trade, and employment. Small businesses began to emerge, relying on both local initiative and access to broader markets. West Berliners collaborated in mentoring, investment, and partnership, creating a web of support and integration. Each transaction, each training session, and each enterprise built upon the previous, cumulatively reshaping the economic landscape. The city's financial revival mirrored the broader lesson: meaningful change grows through repeated, deliberate actions rather than sudden upheaval. Education, as ever, reinforced the principles of persistence and gradual transformation. Schools emphasized both historical knowledge and practical skills, teaching students to understand the wall's legacy while preparing them for the opportunities of a unified city. Classroom projects fostered collaboration across former divisions, helping young people experience firsthand the value of sustained, incremental effort. Over repeated years of engagement, a generation emerged that internalized the lessons of patience, persistence, and the cumulative effect of small actions in shaping outcomes. As we continue our journey through Berlin's history, let us settle into the story with calm reflection. Imagine the city after decades of division, streets once silent and monitored, now filled with the quiet hum of daily life, the footsteps of people moving freely where movement had been restricted for years. Berlin, as it stands today, is more than just a city. It is a living testament to patience, persistence, and the gradual triumph of human determination over barriers, both physical and ideological. The fall of the Berlin Wall did not happen overnight. It was not a single act of rebellion or an isolated political decision. Instead, it was the result of decades of persistent effort by individuals, families, communities, and even nations. Citizens of East Berlin, constrained by surveillance and restriction, never lost the desire for freedom, connection, and dignity. Over the years, they engaged in countless quiet acts, listening to forbidden radio broadcasts, sharing information, assisting neighbors, speaking out when they could. Each act alone may have seemed small, even inconsequential, yet accumulated over time, creating a wave of pressure and expectation that governments and institutions could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, in West Berlin and across the Western world, awareness of the wall's existence fostered solidarity. Diplomacy, media, cultural exchange, and economic connections created a persistent external influence that quietly chipped away at the wall's symbolic and practical power. Information crossed borders, ideas circulated, and the notion of a shared humanity persisted despite ideological barriers. Even when direct intervention was impossible, repeated gestures, news broadcasts, letters, advocacy, and visits sustained hope and reminded East Berliners that the world was watching and that change was possible. Within the geopolitical framework, significant shifts were also unfolding. The Soviet Union, facing economic strain and calls for reform, slowly allowed more autonomy to its satellite states. Policies of openness and restructuring created an environment where citizens could press for change without immediate repression. Across Eastern Europe, repeated acts of civil courage, protest, and advocacy converged, creating an unstoppable momentum. Berlin, at the heart of the divide, became the focal point where decades of small, persistent actions by ordinary people, governments, and institutions alike culminated in a historical turning point. When the wall finally fell, it appeared sudden to the outside world, yet in reality, it was the visible result of years of persistent, cumulative effort. Ordinary citizens crossed borders, celebrated newfound freedom, and engaged with a world that had long been obscured. Neighborhoods reopened, families reunited, and communities slowly wove themselves together again. Markets flourished, schools integrated, and workplaces adapted to bring East and West Berliners together. Each incremental step, every conversation, every collaboration, every decision to persevere, combined to transform the city socially, economically, and culturally. Education played a pivotal role throughout this period. Teachers guided students through the complexities of history while helping them adapt to a unified society. Collaborative projects, discussions, and shared learning cultivated empathy and understanding. Students absorbed not only historical facts, but also the underlying lesson of persistence, that real change occurs gradually through repeated, patient effort. Over time, these lessons reinforced a generational understanding of responsibility, cooperation, and the long-term impact of human action. Cultural engagement was equally essential. Museums preserved stories of life under the wall, memorials commemorated acts of courage, and artistic projects allowed citizens to express collective memory. Music, theater, and public festivals became arenas for collaboration and unity. The repeated act of creating, sharing, and participating in culture reinforced social cohesion, strengthened shared identity, and helped heal the psychological legacy of division. The city itself became a living museum, a testament to the power of repeated human effort in shaping history and society. Economically, Berlin's revival was incremental but profound. Entrepreneurs, workers, and policymakers collaborated to integrate markets and industries that had operated under vastly different systems. East Berliners adapted through retraining, investment, and enterprise development. West Berliners offered guidance, resources, and partnerships. Over decades, these small, persistent actions resulted in tangible economic growth, reduced disparities, and new opportunities for all citizens. The process illustrated the broader principle that sustained effort, repeated consistently over time, can reshape systems and create enduring prosperity. Psychologically and socially, the city healed slowly. Trust had to be rebuilt, relationships re-established, and communities reintegrated. Citizens engaged repeatedly in dialogue, counseling, and communal activities, gradually overcoming the emotional impact of division. Every small interaction, a shared meal, a conversation, a collaborative project, helped reconstruct the social fabric. Berlin's residents learned that reconciliation, like freedom itself, is not instantaneous but the result of patient, persistent work. Politically, Berlin became a model of integration. Legal systems, civic institutions, and administrative structures harmonized gradually. Public services, from healthcare to education, were adjusted repeatedly to serve all residents equitably. Policies were refined, evaluated, and re-implemented over time, demonstrating that enduring governance is the product of sustained, careful effort. The city's transformation illustrated that structural change, like social and cultural change, is cumulative, built from the persistent application of ideas, labor, and collaboration. When we consider the question posed by our title, why did the Berlin Wall fall? The answer emerges not as a single moment of dramatic action, but as a long, complex process of persistent human determination. The wall fell because ordinary people refused to accept division as permanent. It fell because small acts of courage, curiosity, and connection accumulated over decades. It fell because governments, institutions, and societies gradually responded to persistent pressure and the enduring desire for freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall was both inevitable and surprising. Inevitable because of the decades of sustained effort, surprising because such monumental change often appears sudden when viewed from the outside. Today, Berlin stands as a living example of what persistent human effort can achieve. Its neighborhoods, schools, markets, and cultural spaces reflect decades of incremental work to overcome division. The city's economic recovery, social integration, and cultural richness are the product of repeated, patient actions, ordinary choices, and collaborations that, over time, created extraordinary outcomes. Berlin teaches us that transformation is rarely immediate. It is cumulative, built on the persistence, courage, and resilience of countless individuals acting over time. In reflecting on this history, we also recognize a broader lesson for all of us. Whether in societies, communities, or personal lives, meaningful change is rarely sudden. It arises from repeated effort, collaboration, and the refusal to give up, even when progress seems slow or invisible. The story of Berlin is a reminder that each small act, each decision to persist, each act of connection, each effort to learn, share, or improve, contributes to a larger transformation that can shape history. Thank you for watching this video. I hope this calm exploration of Berlin's history has allowed you to reflect not only on the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also on the quiet power of persistence, patience, and cumulative effort in shaping our world. Make sure to take a moment to think about the small actions in your own life and how, repeated over time, they might create change that feels just as monumental as the opening of that wall.